President Cleveland finished out his term and going into the election of 1896. He's exhausted. He's battered by his allies and foes, and so certainly Cleveland is ready to stick to George Washington's precedent of only 2 terms. And so he's going to step aside. The nation's still suffering from the effects of the recession of 1893. The Pullman strike has only recently been put down, and the gold supply is safe for the moment. So the issues are there for the campaign of 1896, and the Republicans turn to their greatest asset. He had been the architect of the McKinley Tariff in the previous Harrison administration, and he had been highly successful in Congress, a veteran of the Civil War, a resident of the state of Ohio, which was considered key to any victory in presidential politics. He was certainly firm on the gold standard, and he was a favorite of a Republican organizer and campaign manager, Marcus Alonzo Hanna. Now, historians have made a lot out of the relationship between Hanna and William McKinley, saying that William McKinley had little drive, little motivation, that he wasn't a good candidate, that he was a tool of the Republican leadership, and that he wasn't his own man. And that's entirely unfair to President McKinley. McKinley, as a congressman, had distinguished himself. He was a former Civil War veteran, so he had been in combat, had seen the nature of warfare. He was certainly a robust individual, but he was somewhat handicapped by the fact he had an invalid wife. His wife suffered from seizures, and McKinley didn't trust a lot of people to take care of her, and so McKinley tended to want to stay close to her side. Quite often he's criticized for not traveling and not doing more, but he simply didn't want to leave his wife. And at presidential dinner parties later, after he's elected, McKinley would be in tune with his wife, and at dinner or state affairs, if she went into a seizure, and it was a seizure that was hard for an outsider to recognize that she was having, and in the midst of the seizure, she would drool, and her face would become drawn. And so quite often McKinley, especially at dinners, would lay a napkin across her face and protect her modesty. People weren't as vulgar as they are today with bodily functions, and were more genteel in their dining habits, and so he wanted to preserve her dignity, so he would cover her mouth and upper chest with his napkin, and then once the seizure passed, he would remove it. But he was content in running what some have called a front porch campaign, in which he had key notes prepared in short speeches, and he would go out on his front lawn and address whatever crowds had gathered, and he would make short trips to New York or to D.C. or to Philadelphia to address conventions and crowds, but he really didn't travel the nation as other candidates had in the past and would in this campaign. Opposing McKinley would be William Jennings Bryan. Now, in the 1896 election, William Jennings Bryan is going to be the choice of the Democratic Party. Engineering his nomination, William Jennings Bryan managed to finagle in a day and time when candidates rarely addressed a nominating convention. William Jennings Bryan arranged to be the last speaker in the convention before the balloting began. And in that speech, borrowing from the refrains that he had used in his speech to the Senate against the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, William Jennings Bryan would address the Democratic Convention with his Cross of Gold speech. And as he began that speech, he stated, I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. We have petitioned, and our petitions have been scorned. We have entreated, and our entreaties have been disregarded. We have begged, and they have mocked our calamity. And when our calamity came, we beg no longer. We entreat no more. We petition no more. We defy them. And so William Jennings Bryan then proceeded into his famous Cross of Gold speech. And once again, using the refrain and the imagery of Jesus on the cross, ending with that great announcement that you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon the cross of gold. The galleries went wild. The crowd went wild. The convention exploded. There was no doubt that William Jennings Bryan was going to get the nomination. Now, the way the conventions went in that day and time, they would hold the first ballot, and delegates that were pledged to certain candidates were, of course, required to, or at least obligated, to vote for that candidate. And since no one got a majority on the first ballot, they proceeded into a second ballot. And Bryan will win and have enough delegates to win on the fifth ballot. Now you think, well, that's a lot of ballots, 5 balloting. Well, many times in these conventions, they would go to 50 and 60 ballots. And with each ballot, there would be a short pause, and the various people involved would try to horse trade. Alliances would be made. Your cause, I'll support your cause for your votes. And then a candidate would go to his supporters and say, okay, I'm out of it. I've agreed to support so-and-so. So if you, when it comes time to cast for me, I'm going to give my votes to them. And so this kind of horse trading went on. And so the fact that Bryan wins in the fifth ballot is incredibly quick and shows his popularity. Now, it wasn't a universal popularity. There are pro-gold Democrats who are incensed that the crazy radical Bryan has seized the nomination. Those who support gold see these silverites and their desire for inflation and desire to expand the currency and reduce the value of American money. They see it as dangerous. Dangerous and scary for the future of the nation. In fact, one Democrat senator, Senator John Palmer of Illinois, addressed the convention and he said, "Fellow Democrats, I will not consider it any great fault if you decide to cast your vote for William McKinley." And so you see a clear rift develop in the Democratic Party. And whenever a rift develops in a party, usually the other party wins. And so the Democrats, while nominating William Jennings Bryan, there's a large element of the Democratic Party that are simply not going to support him and will either stay home or will vote for William McKinley. Now, in a rare move, William Jennings Bryan is also going to be nominated as the candidate of the Populist Party. The problem is William Jennings Bryan, as a Democrat, refuses to go third party. And so while the Populists nominate him, and most of them are going to support the issue of silver, that's their thing, by nominating Bryan, they run the risk of their issues and their identity being absorbed in the Democratic Party. And that's usually what happens to American third parties. They have a cause, they advocate that cause, one of the two major parties then modifies their platform, adopts that cause or a candidate that supports that cause, and they fade away. And so William Jennings Bryan will become the candidate of the Populist Party and the Democratic Party, and the Populist Party is going to fade away. It's going to be absorbed into the Democratic Party. And so the election of 1896 is about issue. It's about personality too. It's about the reserved conservatism of William McKinley versus the liberal radicalism of William Jennings Bryan. And the two are going to have totally different approaches to almost every aspect of public speaking, of presentation, of their legislative agenda, of what they want to accomplish, the people they would surround themselves with. But there are also huge issues out there. And the number one issue is gold versus silver. And in fact, to illustrate the gold versus silver controversy, a book will be written, A Political Allegory. And you know of this book. You've probably seen it from your childhood. I know I was a little kid the first time I saw The Wizard of Oz. It scared the hell out of me. I mean, it's an intimidating movie. Now, compared to movies today, there's nothing in it, but it was a radical movie back in the day. But the book, as it was originally published by Frank Baum, is a political allegory. It takes people, characters, events, and things, and they represent other things. And so the story of Dorothy, who represents the common American worker, the debtor, the populist voter, is represented by the innocent and virtuous Dorothy, who's caught up in the storm of her times. And in this tornado or cyclone, as Baum indicates, it's a political revolution. And she's swept to this other world, the world of Oz. And in that world, she meets characters that are from the politics of the day. She meets the Tin Man. Well, they represent industry workers. And the Scarecrow, obviously farmers. The Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, wanting him to be bolder. If he'd been any more bolder, he'd have been a Kansas City fire truck. But wanting him to be more bold and to lead the workers. Originally, and it was changed for the movie version, but in the book, the yellow brick road represents, of course, the gold standard. But Dorothy walks not on ruby slippers, but on silver slippers, representing the silver standard on the gold standard. And she has to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City being Washington, D.C. And then, of course, you have the wicked witches in the movie or in the book. Each one of those represents anybody who disagreed with the populist agenda. So the Wicked Witch of the East representing the railroads and the railroad tycoons, and we've already talked about men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan and the great industrialist. But specifically, the Wicked Witch of the East was targeted at the railroads. Well, why are the populists upset at the railroads? Well, the railroads engaged in a lot of questionable business practices. Charging more for the short haul as opposed to the long haul, rebates, pooling, interlocking directories, all the things that we've talked about as reform candidates have come to the national forefront, all of those issues were represented by the railroads. And the Wicked Witch of the West, Western politicians that seem to be in cahoots with the Eastern establishment. The wizard could represent the politicians and or the bankers. And then, of course, the winged monkeys. And remember, all of these are open to interpretation. Baum insists this wasn't an allegory, but it's all there. It fits too tightly not to be an allegory. It's very much like J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He insisted to his dying day that wasn't an allegory of World War I, but it's all there with the hobbits being the Shire, etc. The hobbits in the Shire being England and Mordor being the Germans. And so you see all of these elements tied in there. And so the winged monkeys represent the Native Americans. And so this political allegory kind of driving the debate and the discourse. William Jennings Bryan is going to traverse the nation, giving thousands of speeches, denouncing not only McKinley, denouncing the tariff, denouncing Republicans, denouncing bankers, all of the target of his populist message of monetizing silver, demonetizing or reducing the influence of gold, which will put more money in circulation so that the debtor will have more money to pay off his loans. And of course the banks don't want that. They loaned money at a certain value. They want those loans repaid at that value, not at a inflated currency. In fact, a number of very high-profile people spoke out against William Jennings Bryan. The New York Tribune called William Jennings Bryan, and I quote, "a wretched, rattle-pated boy posing in vapid vanity and mouthing resounding rottenness." Theodore Roosevelt, who would never be any fan of William Jennings Bryan, called him a silverite crazy. And many said, and Theodore Roosevelt echoed, that an election of Bryan would be a national calamity. And so preying on these fears, William McKinley is able to raise a huge war chest of cash to fight William Jennings Bryan. And as Bryan travels the nation, giving speech after speech after speech, William McKinley sits at home in Ohio, are making those brief trips, delivering his speeches. And on Election Day, William McKinley is going to easily carry the election. And thus, with William McKinley elected and his promise to return to prosperity, almost overnight, the Depression came to an end. The expansion of the national market through international agreements, all the things coinciding at once. The acquisition of empire, which we will soon talk about, the expansion into the Philippines, the expansion into Asian markets, opening up more areas for American goods to go, which brings prosperity back home. The McKinley introduces the Dingley Tariff of 1897. The Dingley Tariff of 1897, the highest tariff to that time, protects American industry, brings more profits into American business. Yes, it drives up the cost of goods, but workers are making more under the protection of the tariff. And so economic prosperity returns, aided in no small part by a number of gold strikes that bring natural inflation. The gold coming into the government, allowing the government to put more gold in circulation, thus inflating the currency, but inflating it with gold, not silver. And then the invention of a new process to extract gold. I've been watching on TV a lot lately the various programs they have about Alaska and gold mining in the Alaskan wilderness. Well, one of the things that's invented in the 1890s as McKinley comes into office is the cyanide process, using cyanide to extract gold from quartz. And so previously discarded gold, because it was too labor intensive to pull the gold out of the quartz. If it could be chipped off or it was already in flake form, it could be easily used, or if it was a nugget. But if it was wound through the quartz, that was considered waste. Now with the cyanide process, eating away the quartz, leaving the gold, more gold is recovered from every yard of earth that they examine. And so in 1900, because of the increase of the gold supply, and in fact, one of the figures that I've seen is that the Alaskan wilderness from 1897 to 1904 would add some $100 million worth of gold to the American economy. So that's what we're talking about, more money going into circulation. He didn't need silver. And it gave the appearance, at least, that McKinley was right and William Jennings Bryan had been wrong. And in fact, 1900, Congress passes the Gold Standard Act, which marked an end to the silver movement. Now, William Jennings Bryan is going to be back, but he's going to be back with modified issues. And the politics of the tariff and the politics of silver soon going to be drowned out by the call to war, the Spanish-American War, which we'll examine in the next section. But with President McKinley safely at the helm and the gold standard firmly in place, the nation seemed to be on its way to great prosperity, great wealth, and expansion that rise as we begin this section where the United States was a second-tier nation. By the turn of the century and by the ascension of William McKinley, which I would argue was the first modern president, and maybe to his negative, the first imperial president, as he takes office and the nation is established and has established itself as one of the preeminent economies of the world and certainly one of the preeminent industrial nations of the world. And that industrialism and that economic might is going to lead to the search for new worlds to conquer, which we'll talk about next time.